Welcome to CivilNet. On Sunday, December 6th, Armenian voters headed to the polls to vote in a very critical referendum on a package of constitutional reforms. While the online world seemed to say that the no vote was going to win, in fact, the Central Electoral Commission early this morning released its final results with the overwhelming majority of voters actually voting to, in fact, adopt a new constitution. Now, here to talk to me about the referendum is Vahe Grigoryan. He is a human rights lawyer, and he was a legal consultant for the Citizen Observation Mission that deployed about 1,000 observers to about 500 polling stations across the country. Vahe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You had a very long day and a very long night, tallying the votes, following the observers. Before we talk about the actual mechanics of the mission that you were also a part of, I want to ask you a question, perhaps not a fair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think that the vote that took place on Sunday reflected the will of the Armenian people? Is this new constitution that we will be living under a legitimate document that will determine the fate and the future of this country?
Well, I think that your question seems to be a very rhetoric one. I would doubt that anyone in Armenia would have another answer, especially those in the ruling party who organized all these ceremonies, which they would call since now on, still continue call since now on as referendum. Actually, this is our reality already almost 2 decades, a bit less than 2 decades. And we should be clear about that the populations, the electors' vote was expressed during this process, but it's not reflected in the results of this, at least preliminary results. That the Central Electoral Commission recently released, and but I will focus more on those precincts where observers were present from our mission. In a couple of days, the final reports of observers will be published also, and there will be a clear pattern seen. A clear difference between the results in those precincts where there weren't observers, and at least independent observers, and in those precincts where there were observers, and which will show what was the real will of people. And this real will of people, as we could observe during all night yesterday, receiving results from precincts, was about that no was overweighting yes in most of the precincts by 2-3 times. And so we are, but at the moment we are facing processes which we might have forgotten for a while, but.
Okay, look, just to get back to the observers, the Citizen Observation Mission, it was brought together by a number of organizations in Armenia, and as I said in the opening remarks, there were about 1,000 observers that were deployed to different polling stations. So what you're saying is that where there were observers, in general, or the majority of those polling stations, the no vote was winning or won, and in those precincts where there weren't the observers, it was a yes vote. Now we have to, just for our viewers, there's 1,997 polling stations right across the country. So this observation mission had about observers in 500 things.
Yeah, almost.
So from your analysis and reports that we should be seeing in the coming days and weeks, we will see this pattern?
This pattern is very clear. It's very clear, and it does not leave any doubt that the message of the authorities was that unless you combat and do not allow us to commit crime and electoral fraud, we are those who are devotedly committed to conduct this crime, and they did it during lockdown. I'm not speaking about something new that I face it or my colleagues face it. But this is the new thing in all of this is that this pattern will be clearly drawn, and the second thing which will be new is that observing missions, Armenian observing missions of Armenian organizations and Armenian citizens managed to organize their mission in a very systemic way, so that they institutionalize all this process already. And this is something that should be welcomed for. It was long expected process. It was long expected result. In some of the regions in Armenia, you can even notice that this observing missions activity and intensity in supervising the processes resulted even in acknowledging, even by Central Electoral Commission, that the results there are not those who would be mostly welcomed by ruling party. Possibly people will be held responsible for this, who should have organized and security effective the efficiency of fraud machine in those regions. But this shows that there is hope that the electoral system will be one day brought under legal control of...
I'm going to interrupt you for a second, because what you're saying is really quite astonishing. So 1,000 people this time around, hopefully during the next election, in order to cover the majority of the precincts of the polling stations, double that number, or triple that number, and they can start to change the paradigm in the country.
Well, I was a bit unfair not to mention also the proxies of political party, but since I do not want to bring our conversations into the bias to one or two political forces or against one or two political forces, that's why I didn't mention. There was a great support from those proxies of those political parties also. There are some legal procedures which the observers cannot present the results of their observations themselves within those scopes. So they were cooperating with these people, and these people enabled this machine to work, electoral supervision machine to work. But yeah, it's an astonishing picture. This means that apart from thinking to reform the system, electoral system, also we should attach importance to train and to have people in polling stations. This is not something new that we know during all this process, but this is now recorded as a matter of fact, and as a matter of fact and figures anymore.
You know, here at CivilNet, you know, we worked about 16 hours yesterday, and we had our crews in different regions of the country. And not only from our own reporters, but just ordinary citizens, the number of complaints that kept coming in. We just could not address every single complaint of violations that were coming in. And there were instances of ballot box stuffing. I thought we had moved beyond that very crude method of trying to impact the results of the election. We had physical violence, we had intimidation, we had commissions, you know, trying to postpone the actual count in order to ensure the observers left. So instead of moving forward, our impression was that we had moved backward. Did you see, or is it because of social media and digital technologies that we're hearing about these more? But from your own experience, did we take a step back, or did the authorities take a step back by utilizing these kinds of crude techniques?
Well, I wouldn't say that we as a country, as a nation, stepped back. We always were there. There was no step forward at all. It just during this observing mission during this referendum simply showed that we never stepped forward ever. The fact that we didn't notice or we didn't record this scale of violence during, for example, 2013 elections, presidential elections, does not speak about that the authorities are committed to organize this process of elections or referendums in a way that is more or less a step forward to some standards. I wouldn't call them international, I would rather call them constitutional standards, Armenian standards. It is just, this is just a matter of fact that they didn't need to use this tool from their arsenal. During these elections, they were left without any choice rather than to commit violence again. So this doesn't mean that we had any progress, this does mean that we hadn't any progress before. This means that the progress was imitated usually. Well, we are coming to the assessment or approach of international organizations about organization and running the electoral processes of Armenia now. When we are speaking about step forward or step back, we usually think about these international organizations reports, and I see that your next question is coming.
Before we talk about sort of the international community, expectations, you know, OSCE, ODIHR, any kind of foreign missions, something struck me as you were saying it, but doesn't this show the weakness of the authorities when they have to utilize these kinds of techniques? Well, that means that they're either scared or they're weak, or they understood that they weren't going to win?
I think I wouldn't call it scare. Well, let me put it in this way. I think this clearly showed that they are unable to manage their fraud machine efficiently as they could before. And this is also because of the threat that they felt. And the threat is the vector of threat that they felt during these elections is voters lists. Voters lists pushed them out of the scopes of the control of this fraud machine. Voters, I should go into some details.
Yeah, please, again, for our viewers, voters lists are not published prior to elections. So political parties, different coalitions, whatever kind of election we're having, whether it's a referendum, a presidential or parliamentary election, a political party doesn't have access, let's say, if they're running for parliament, of the actual voters list, because I think it was the Venice Commission that also confirmed that yes, it might be an invasion of privacy, but I know that in many countries voters lists are published, but in Armenia it isn't. Tell me where this stemmed from, and is it possible to change this? Or would it alleviate corruption or election rigging?
Well, the participants of electoral processes are not formally, legally, are not entirely deprived of to access the signed voters list. We're speaking about signed voters list. But the limit of access to this voters list makes this access inefficient at all. I mean, no one needs this to have in order to try to use the information of voters list. So this is an ill practice. This is a wrong practice that Armenian Constitutional Court adopted in 2003. And unfortunately, it was strongly supported by Venice Commission of Council of Europe. In this sense, I'm very clear about that if this autocracy has any devoted and strong ally, it is the international bureaucracy at all.
So they're compounding the problem instead of helping to solve it, the international bureaucracy, as you call it?
I think there is not even such a task to solve the problem. It's all about short-term political interests and purposes. But long-term, in a long-term perspective, when supporting this approach of Armenian authorities to classify the voters list, I mean, they simply ruined last hopes of democracy in Armenia. voters list is a technical tool. It's a very technical tool. Not everyone is obliged to go into very details to understand all of this. But the voters list is in the core of Armenian fraud electoral machine. This is the first time that observers targeted directly on voters list, that they have right under electoral code to familiarize themselves with the signed voters list. And also the proxies have the right to take copies of the voters lists, take information from voters lists during the appealing process of electoral procedures, which authorities already by use of violence, mostly by use of violence or other types of electoral violations or breaches, prevented to. So so violence in polling stations returned to help fraud committers to prevent the observers to access the voters list. This is what the fraud machine was reacting so strongly against. So, but overall, as an answer to your this and former question is that there wasn't ever step forward in any Armenian election having not committing violence in polling station, for example, in 2013, is not something that from the point of electoral observing missions, especially international electoral observing missions, should be seen as a progress at all, because there is always a question that, not a question, they should understand that this or that tool, forbidden, restricted tool, is not used not because of the will of authorities, not because of the legal regulation became very effective to prevent it to happen, but simply because there was no need to commit it. So there is a big question now rising about all reports of international organizations happened to be before, during every and each previous elections about step forward to what it resulted. And I think there will be no room about speaking that the report might be focused only about that process and things could have gone worse during the period started from that report up until now. There are simply 2 years from last report of international observers. Nothing happened during 2 years with Armenian law, with Armenian judicial or administrative processes concerning electoral elections and referendums. So which means that this referendum, violence in polling stations, vivid falsification of documents, false registrations in voters lists, which I'm speaking about those which are recorded at the moment, but you may imagine
there's many that aren't.
Which scale is it in an unrecorded world. So this simply reflected the reality, electoral reality of Armenia, and so lessons to be drawn from is the next question. So what's next? First of all, for each and every international mission to Armenia, each and every international official in Armenia, voters lists, signed voters lists should be published. This is what I am as practicing lawyer, practicing also in electoral law, and having participated in almost all those processes started from 2007. There is absolutely no alternative of publishing signed voters list. If any international employee has the second opinion about this, there should be a clear and very founded analysis to this drawn from Armenian practice. It's not about standards which are very vaguely and abstractly drawn from the practices of other jurisdictions. And the second lesson learned is that all this legislation and all the system, legislation also concerning voters list, but also some other appealing process and all of this, should be changed at least 1 year before every and each election. Because we're facing the same problem each and every time. And the third one is, please keep yourself within your ethical scopes. And I would address this message especially to the Venice Commission, and especially to the President of the Venice Commission. You are an international employee. You are a representative of international organizations, of a very reputable, very well-known and very much respected organization of Council of Europe. You cannot propagate or be a party of a political debate in Armenia. All you were obliged to do, to look at the compliance of the draft presented to the Venice Commission, to the international, especially European standards of Council of Europe, which you clearly failed to do. But instead you came to Armenia and were propagating and also campaigning for adopting this draft. Violence in polling station, I will put it this way, violence in polling station is also sanctioned, having had in the back of their mind that there's strong support of European organizations, of Council of Europe structures to this draft, to adoption of this draft. This is what always happens when someone abuses the scope. Later reflection of the authorities' response is not necessarily to happen to be on the political field. All what they showed in the polling stations yesterday night during calculation of votes, during the voting process, is what authorities drawn from the messages of Venice Commission. Well, I do not want that all what I said to be seen as something we having. Well, very simple example. I will speak about simply one example. Whole Venice Commission, all opinions of Venice Commissions, never reflected such contradictions. I'm not speaking about non-compliance. I'm speaking about clear contradictions with the requirements of European Convention of Human Rights on various basic rights. For example, take the right of freedom of religion, thought and conscience, conscience. And I mean, we are simply shocked that during all this process of releasing opinions, no one pointed that there is a contradiction with Article 9 of the Convention, and there is no jurisdiction in the Council of Europe, within the scopes of Council of Europe, that is allowed interference into right of freedom of elections for the aim of national security. There's a clear case law of the court. There's a clear approach of other Council of Europe institutions of this. But instead of going into these details and standards, assessing them properly, in order this draft not to be seen as something very controversial, international organizations, representatives of Armenia, basically doing what the authorities should have done during the campaign process, which is very harming also for reputation of these organizations. So there will be clear analysis also of all electoral, of all the reports of international organizations in Armenia, started from 2007 to up to now, about elections and this referendum. And I think that some of those civil society some of those non-governmental organizations who are participating, Observer Citizen Mission, will publish their opinion about this and about the impact that this kind of approach had on Armenian democracy here.
Many lessons to be learned and drawn from this experience, starting from cleaning up our own house and being able, through our own citizen observers in Armenia, to hold the authorities to account or to somehow alleviate their fraud machine, as you called it. The role of international missions, Venice Commission, publicizing voters lists, comparison with other elections. I mean, there's endless topics that we could cover. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank you, Vahe, for taking the time. I know you probably haven't slept all night, and hopefully these new kind of online, offline warriors, these new observers, will perhaps change something in the electoral processes to come in the future.
Yeah, our hope is the same. Our hope is the same, and our purpose is not. Our target is not only to point on those lacks of electoral law and practice, judicial and administrative, but also to extend the scopes of this observer citizen project generally, and not only particularized towards what happened. This is, as you said, the bridging between of these two, as you mentioned, on and offline worlds, and this bridges, and our thoughts is that not the bridge should be extended, but there should be established more and more these kind of bridges, as we do not see any other effective way in controlling the electoral machine. The authorities clearly sent their message. This message was clear years ago, but it will be shown now in facts and figures that what they say is, unless you resist it, we will commit the fraud. We are, they are quite clear on this.
Right. Well, we look forward to the report. I'm sure it would be very illuminating. Thank you so much for coming, and good luck with the rest of the work you have ahead of you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
too.
I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest was human rights lawyer Vahe Grigoryan. Keep following CivilNet.